I agree with that. And while I think that intuition is ultimately like the product of experience, that doesn't mean that experience, if left unquestioned, will make your intuition better.
Yeah.
I think that it's very possible that if you kind of let experiences just sort of pass you by without taking the opportunity to like interrogate what their context was, maybe take notes after the fact, especially when it comes to qualitative data, you might just remember things that like emotionally agreed with you, but really trying to capture a complete picture and preserve it in a way. Honestly, like creating data from your experiences, I think is really the way to make sure that your experiences are improving your intuition.
Good morning, my Pamplemies. This is Mike Check Mike.
Hi, this is Eugene.
This is Jonathan.
And today we have this beautiful team here to jump into the big question where we take challenging and conceptual questions. And today's question will be, how do you balance data-driven decisions with intuition? So I'm pretty excited for this one because it's kind of a complex and very layered type of question. So maybe to give it some direction, we can start with the, call it a first sub-question of, is intuition simply an excuse for avoiding the hard work of gathering more data?
I don't think so.
No, next question. Easy.
Oh, it can be if
thought-provoking.
misused. I think intuition is a good red flag or maybe like warning light that you might be doing something off. I feel like intuition is sort of like a best fit model that you kind of create on accident just by looking at different examples. So in a way, it's loosely data driven, but only in the way that like a zeroth order model is. Like, for example, I think professionals in a field have very good intuition because they've seen lots of examples of what they're working with. And so they can make very accurate calls just kind of off the cuff using their intuition. Whereas if you're to take, like, let's say someone who knows, as an example, like nothing about aerospace, and you ask them like, how heavy is a typical plane? They probably, I mean, they might be able to guess it. They're like, well, I know how much a car is and I can, guesstimate based on sizes.
Yeah, get pretty close with that initial estimate where you have a sense of...
Even then, you're using kind of your best fit from the car and you're just applying a factor to scale it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think intuition should be used for every decision, but I think it can, if you're getting, like, let's say you make a model, it can maybe cue you into a improper assumption. Though, of course, your intuition has assumptions too that you need to watch out for.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think the intuition without validation, or the kind of like to go back to that data-driven part, is where things get risky. That's where if you don't have that, you end up letting kind of emotions guide things potentially. At least, your emotions are kind of masquerading as intuition as opposed to being, like you said, something more data-driven, like having that intuition, maybe through experience of, what's the ballpark weight of that aeroplane too? Like, it's not 1 kilogram, right? So you're talking about a drone. So I guess in that sense, it's pretty, pretty practical to have, but it does require having that data feedback loop, I think, in order to not be an excuse. I guess that's where I would kind of put that sort of that definition.
I feel like the amount you should trust your intuition definitely depends on how much experience you have in the field.
Yeah, and it's also you have intuition for technical subjects where you might be able to build it for experience, but I think it's also important in more softer skills. So take hiring, for example. Like, if at first you don't have the data, you may hire through intuition, for example, but then if you kind of make that a habit, you may, even though it started with some kind of data-backed intuition, you may fall into the realm of comfort. And then I think once you fall in the realm of comfort is where you may have that slippery slope of you're actually ending up making emotion-based decisions as opposed to data-based, still under the guise of intuition. But that's where if you have the data as a feedback loop, I think you can maybe escape that vicious circle.
To go on maybe a side tangent, that kind of reminds me that I think that sometimes it can be difficult in hiring, especially because the feedback loop isn't closed. Whereas if you're like a dedicated hiring manager, you might not have information about, you interview someone now and you hire them. You may not know about their performance until a year down the line. And at that point, you may not close the loop and update what you're looking for in candidates.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
that's a tricky problem, especially that might be based more on intuition than data.
Both of you guys were talking about experience being a huge factor with having a good intuition. Michael, when you were coming up with this question earlier before recording, I just really like this question so much, especially because it speaks out to younger individuals like Jonathan and myself, because we haven't really been in the industry for as long as you have, Michael. And of course, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners listening in who've been in the industry, regardless of what sector they're in. They've been on the job for a while. So experience really does help feed that intuition. So going back to that first question you were asking, Michael, about whether or not intuition is an excuse to not do the hard work of gathering data, younger individuals like myself and Jonathan, I'm sure a lot of Gen Z, even millennials, could really do feel tempted to kind of just dive into what we know personally from personal experiences, and that kind of is really what fuels a lot of intuition, where it is, you're drawing back on your past prior experiences, whether they were positive or negative, but they do inform you on what you want to do right now at the present moment. And for me, I would like to think intuition is sort of like trying to extrapolate a trend from a set of data points on the graph. And Mike, I'm sorry, Jonathan, you were talking about having a best fit model on the zeroth order, and that really does tie to what I'm saying right now really well, because intuition really is, again, like what I was saying earlier, intuition is trying to create that trend line, extrapolate the trend based on a data set, but you do need that data to begin with. So a lot of times, the main question you were talking about before, Michael, about is intuition just an excuse to not do the work to make a data-driven decision? If intuition is all that you do and not collecting any data at all whatsoever, then that's really dangerous and it's really bad, because going back to my example, you can't extrapolate a trend if you don't have any data to begin with. And there is a whole other conversation we could get into, is if those data points are valid to begin with. You could fall into that rabbit hole of looking into a lot of cognitive and social biases, like selection bias, confirmation bias, the anchoring effect. And so that's something we should definitely dive into in a bit. But bottom line, yes, you definitely do need that experience. You need to collect good data for sure. But I do generally feel like intuition it does have a time and place in a company when you're making decisions, because just collecting data doesn't give you the full picture. And it's a well-known problem in the industry where people do get quote unquote buried under data, or people just get data tunnel vision as well, where all you end up doing is collect data. But again, like, data can also be both noise and valuable data, but they get mixed together. But also, how do you make sense of that data as well? How do you find the meaning? How do you find the meaning behind what you're looking at? So that's where I think intuition definitely would come in, is because you're looking at all this data and be like, okay, what am I getting from this, and how does this apply to what we're dealing with right now? And how can I use this data in future similar situations, like whatever XYZ situation we're dealing with right now?
Yeah. No, I think you have a really good point, and kind of one of the big takeaways I'm getting from what you're saying there as well is just because you have a data set doesn't mean that the data set is valid. And I think that's a big important distinction. And I think that is a big part of where intuition can be very helpful. And it segues pretty interestingly into another question of, what safeguards can you put in place in order to ensure that whatever intuition you're following is grounded in logic, or at least is free of cognitive biases. So
what you were talking about before, and when I first introduced, was just being able to recognize if there is biases in place, having that awareness. So definitely, just if you're an individual who isn't aware of biases, just do the research, understand what kind of biases are out there, whether it's the confirmation bias, which is a big one, selection bias from gathering data, the anchoring effect, which is something that I kind of fall victim quite a lot if I'm just learning about an unknown subject, which is having your decisions being swayed by the first piece of information that comes to your mind. So whether I'm learning something about computer vision or ethics and engineering, environmental responsibilities, the first piece of info that comes your way, kind of, since you had nothing in your database, in your mind, so to speak, that first piece of info that goes in there kind of sets the tone, so to speak, for what else is to come into your mental database, so to speak. But cognitive biases aside, I would like to even abstract that even a step above that, where it's just be able to recognize what your feelings are with whatever you're dealing with. So, an example could be, say you're a company that is trying to create some sort of product. You're creating like a single page application. You're trying to figure out what it looks like, and you're talking with the rest of your team. And one person on your team maybe has an idea of, this is how the website should look. And then for you, you're like, I don't know about that. Something's bugging me with this design. Well, what is it that's bugging you? That's like kind of, I would like to think that's your intuition. Whether that intuition is well-founded or not, that's a separate discussion. But something about you is saying, hey, there's something about this is bugging me. What is it that's bugging you? Is it coming from a place where you really do feel like this design for this SPA, single page application, is it just not doing the job that's intended to do? Maybe it's coming from whatever it is that's bugging you. Maybe it's coming from a place of anxiety or even just an insecurity. So it's more of a personal issue. But being able to take that step of separating or being able to distance your emotions from the issue at hand, just understanding what's bothering you, what is it, what's driving your intuition at the moment, could really do help first bring awareness to it, but also to help decide what to do next after the fact as well.
I do think that's an important take as well. One thing I do like to practice is, mindfulness essentially, and without sounding too esoteric, it's not any more complicated than looking at that gut feel, for example. And really the distinction is, practicing that mindfulness to understand, am I following that gut feel because it's emotionally driven? Maybe it makes me happy, or XYZ made me angry, and so that's why I want to go do this thing to, I don't know, prove to this person I can do this. Or is it actually anchored at something that's, meaningful or what I should be doing? And I think that's the key to turning intuition into something useful or practical, as opposed to just being sort of call it a knee-jerk or emotionally driven reaction.
Right. It's like it even goes back to our past discussion in the previous episode, like discovering the why, what, how, where the why part could kind of be tied similarly to collecting that data.
Yep.
And the what is kind of like what you're going to do about it. But I think oftentimes with entrepreneurs, it's really easy, very easy to get tempted to do this, where it's like, I want to just do something because it's cool. For example, maybe I want to make a cyber plane. It looks cool. And I think as a person, I would look so cool. I want to be explicit, but I would look really cool if I were seen as an entrepreneur with this cyber plane. So that's coming from a place of maybe insecurities, but again, that's just an emotional feeling, a fluttering of the heart, so to speak. But that's like, I guess that would be like what's the right word? Primal need of like why I'm going to go and just iterate towards the what before the why. The why is what's collecting the data, so to speak. It's going back to my analogy of extrapolating the trends from data. You're seeing the problems, what are people afflicted by in the world or in your community. So that's collecting the data on that graph. How are you finding meaning in this data? So what can I, as an entrepreneur, how can I solve these problems that I'm observing as these data points? That's like the what. Yeah. That's kind of tying the why and the what with intuition, with data-driven decisions. Hopefully that kind of makes sense with what I was saying.
And to your point, you can see that, like you mentioned the example at the beginning, at the very onset of creating a company, for example, I want to go do XYZ because it's cool, right? Also not to be explicit. Or you can even see it when you already have a company, like let's say things are not going as well as you thought they were going to. And then eventually, you kind of have that panic that starts to set in and you're like, okay, well, we're going to go do this. Not necessarily because it's the right thing to do or because you've thought through it, but because, it's like, okay, we need to have anything, for example, right? And so it can lead to this kind of decision as well.
And if you start your company based on a fluttering of the heart and based on emotion, then you are just subject to making decisions based on emotions when trials do come along, when you're faced with a challenging moment where it's like, oh, I want to create a cyber plane because I want to look super cool. Oh, a year from now, I realize no one wants a cyber plane and I'm running out of money and my team hates me because I'm just too emotional or something. Yeah. So you just, you might just want to be tempted to just pivot just because it feels uncomfortable. This is not what I wanted my cyber plane idea to come out to be. So if you're doing everything based on emotions, then again, you're started from the beginning as well as you're not setting your team up for sustainable success, and you're just not being able to power through.
That's a really good point you make. That essentially, once you have you have something that you've intuited, trying to work backwards and figure out, well, where is this coming from? Both from like a psychological mindfulness perspective, and I think that's really important to make sure that you're making decisions for the reasons that you say on the surface. Right. That's really important. I think specifically when it comes to like confirmation bias, making sure that you have people around you that are willing to challenge you on subjects and that you're willing to listen to them. That's huge, because if everyone is essentially just a yes man, then you're going to run into confirmation bias sooner or later, most likely sooner.
Yeah.
And that's part of validating your intuition. Just throw your thoughts out there, hopefully within
see if it lines
closed doors.
Other people's intuition.
Yeah. Because it's like, cause sometimes we walk around with unchecked biases and unchecked thoughts, and sometimes you just have to share it with your colleague, get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion on whatever you have in mind. And people are just like, hey, if people are just like, hey, you're crazy, then okay.
You could even call that gathering more data.
Exactly. That's what it is.
Crazy.
And that's kind of something I actually wanted to explore a bit more, because the whole word of data, because you hear that on LinkedIn, on social media, people are like, oh, data-driven insights, collect your data. But what is data? I imagine some people listening in may be a bit not sure how to put a pin on that. Like, it's the first thing that comes to my mind as an engineer. I'm thinking data, numbers, or something a lot more quantitative. But there is qualitative and quantitative data. But like, what you just brought up, Jonathan, it does open up the floor of like, what is data? And hopefully that kind of helps shed some light on how whatever you are collecting ends up reinforcing, supporting, or strengthening your intuition.
Yeah,
for sure.
No, absolutely. And I think to go back just to your earlier point, if you do lead into, say, starting a company based on emotion, I think it's you end up opening yourself to luck, essentially. Like if you are lucky, that randomly or emotionally driven decision ends up being the right one, but it could be that it was the wrong one, and that may be one of those where you find yourself needing to pivot. And to kind of tie it back into what you're saying, Jonathan, I think I kind of like to call that process like a pre-mortem. It's essentially like structured thinking, and I'm by no means inventing the concept, but essentially when you have that sort of intuition, you're following that thread, like thinking it through of like, where can it fail, where did the assumptions fail, how if I kind of follow that intuition and I think through its implementation, where does that likely take me, what are the different paths? And I think that can help kind of also be a way of gathering that data if you have some feedback and hopefully people to talk to, so that you can kind of challenge those assumptions, play devil's advocate a little bit. That in its way is a simple form of data collection that's not necessarily an Excel sheet of numbers, because sometimes some things lend themselves not as well to that kind, and it might be sort of a more abstracted data, but our brains are still pretty good at taking all that information and recognizing those patterns. But there was something you said earlier about sort of learning something initially, and I kind of want to circle back to that maybe as a last question. It's that notion of primacy, which is when you learn something for the first time, you tend to be very heavily influenced by that item, whether it was an instructor, whether it was how you learned something. I think, it has a huge influence to how you're going to think down the line. And I kind of want to tie that into experience and, essentially asking what role does experience play in changing or shaping your intuition, especially if data is incomplete, like we've been talking about.
I mean, at least to me, it does feel like a bit of a circular question, because at least what we were talking about before, I would say definitely experiences pretty much shape your intuition. It is intuition is backed by experience as well. So to answer your question, what role does experience play in sharpening intuition? I would say the more experience you gain at something, in whatever thing you're doing, if it's just working out or starting a relationship with people, or there's so many things, but like you can gain experiences that shapes your intuition, because you're gathering those data points to extrapolate that trend, and you're like going back to the elementary school example, you're studying these patterns, but like, okay, what comes after the circle? Well, based on my prior experiences, normally I'm told that I'm rewarded if I pick square. Okay, then we'll go with square. And so the more experience, again, it goes back to the whole validity of that data. You got to check the context of that experience. So maybe you were having a toxic relationship with someone, so that kind of made you become less willing to trust people. But then you also kind of so for me, it's like that could kind of enable bad habits for sure. So, but you got to take a second to be like, okay, how did that experience unfold with the given environment and the context? And maybe you have to recognize that experience, as bad as it was, you were dealt a bad hand to begin with. So
yeah, I think that's an important point to maybe linger on to, because I do agree. Experience, we mentioned in the beginning, allows you to, maybe come to a conclusion faster, or to have an idea of what reasonable bounds are for a certain thing. But I do agree as well that sometimes relying on that experience too much, like you said, it's like I've always picked the square, and the square has always paid off for me, so I'm going to keep picking the square. If you don't combine that with good situational awareness, asking yourself, well, what was the situation when I picked the square, and did anything change this time around? It's easy to kind of fall in a pattern, I guess ironically, and just maybe redo something just because at some point you've developed some level of comfort with it. Whereas if you have that situational awareness, and I guess if your takeaway from experience is that by virtue of having needed to learn in the past, you understand the need for continuous learning, I think that's kind of a powerful way to leverage that experience of like, where are times where things have changed and required, adaptability or awareness, and then being able to combine that with the actual skill set of the experience. I think that's where it gets most powerful, essentially.
I agree with that. And while I think that intuition is ultimately like the product of experience, that doesn't mean that experience, if left unquestioned, will make your intuition better. I think that it's very possible that if you kind of let experiences just sort of pass you by without taking the opportunity to like interrogate what their context was, maybe take notes after the fact, especially when it comes to qualitative data, you might just remember things that like emotionally agreed with you, but really trying to capture a complete picture and preserve it in a way. Honestly, like creating data from your experiences, I think is really the way to make sure that your experiences are improving your intuition. Otherwise, you could go through experience after experience, but your intuition might not change the way you want it to. It might go off a different direction, or it might not change much at all because it's still anchored to the first thing that you learned, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And taking a second to let me start again. So you definitely need to have a really flexible mind and open mind to be able to take a look at all your experiences that you accumulated over your lifetime, whatever experiences you're drawing from to address whatever you're trying to deal with right now, and be like, okay, how did each of these experiences play out in the given context? And being able to pick the ones that are actually meaningful and figure out which of the rest are noise and it's just kind of confusing, mudding up the water, so to speak, of your judgment. It's definitely a skill that it's something you need to practice for a while for sure, and it definitely takes some introspection for sure, I think. So there is that. This does kind of raise an interesting topic about having good intuition about your intuition, which reportedly on studies people are really not great at doing. So there could be people who are very intuitive when compared to other people, but when those people are asked, well, how right were you with your intuition? It's that's a bit of a open ballpark where the guesses are wild, but a lot of times people are really inaccurate with what they decide.
Yeah, I think from studies I've seen, and maybe that dates back about 2 years ago, it was somewhere around the mark of 80% of intuition turned out to be wrong, which you'd think it probably would be 50-50, but it's actually a substantial amount of intuition being incorrect, which I think gives a lot of weight to the question we're asking today, right? It's like, obviously intuition is not necessarily a great tool in and of itself unless you're able to sort of keep it in check through some mechanisms. And I think having that sort of awareness that intuition can be heavily biased and be able to sort of preemptively prepare for that can help people come out on top as better entrepreneurs, better partners, whether personal or business, better engineers. And I think at all levels really of contribution, it can play an important role.
Right.
So with that, let's jump into our second segment, Thanks Mom, where we ask ChatGPT to give us 2 words to ideate around to creatively explore business ideas that you, the audience, are free to run with.
Take it away, Eugene.
Are we ready? That's
never, but go for it.
All right, Mom.
Gonna caffeinate for this.
I had a good rest over the weekend, so hopefully I'm ready for this. This one is called Crystal Umbrella.
Well, we had crystal balloon before.
Quartz balloon. That's
Quartz
That's
balloon.
the first that came in my head.
Okay.
So I was like, that's a little similar. Do we want to try it again? Maybe does that sound too similar?
Oh, we can run with it. Yeah, I think it's fair game.
Yeah, sure.
Quartz umbrella. Okay.
Or crystal umbrella.
Oh, crystal. I'm sorry.
Umbrella.
Right.
Well, we're not going to repeat any of our ideas from quartz balloon. I don't think.
No.
Yeah, check out that episode
we would
if you
never
haven't
stoop that low.
heard that.
Yeah. No. Let's and maybe that's a good chance to take it in a more loose direction than in order to not say
Yeah,
go away
for
from
sure.
the last prompt.
Yeah, absolutely.
An umbrella you can see through as it's
Well,
raining down.
those
upon
already
you.
exist.
They could have been
Typically,
plastic.
they're plastic.
Yeah, you don't
though,
need
not
crystals for
crystal.
that.
Yeah.
It's a
Different
niche
material,
market.
for sure.
I mean, people use the word umbrella to kind of generalize a certain category or something. So maybe a company could be using crystals for a wide range of applications.
That's true.
Maybe.
I'm torn between the umbrella side of it, which would be, maybe sheltering you from something, protecting you in a sense. The crystal part, maybe with the umbrella, is like you're selectively letting something through. Maybe.
when I think of the word umbrella, I'm thinking like a fabric or something that has crystal, but has a wide surface area that is interacting with some sort of fluid, or whether that's a liquid or a gas. So maybe one thing from the top of my head would probably maybe be solar sails, or also could also be crystal umbrella could be an umbrella literally, but something that you use to protect yourself from a radioactive environment, or maybe from a solar wind. I'm thinking of it here on Mars. I don't know if umbrella would protect you from the radiation environment, but maybe there's something that has a directional flow that you can block with an umbrella. Again, I don't know if crystals have that kind of
a really good point. Perhaps maybe it has to do with kind of the ideas to create maybe like transparent shelters for off-road exploration that maybe allow, obviously like, light in to a degree, but also block some of the harmful radiation from space.
Yeah, like a greenhouse, but blocking some of that radiation while letting useful light for, say, photosynthesis if you're trying to grow something. My mind was going into the photonic recycling realm of if you're trying to use a photon to push something in space, you'll get a small amount of push. It kind of goes, I think the solar cells may have kickstarted that idea, where you're essentially using light to push something. But there's that concept of photonic recycling, which is if you shoot a laser at a target, that particle of light will go hit that target and then bounce back and then you could recycle that bounce a bunch of times. Now it's technically pushing both objects, but you could recycle that photon 100 times, 1,000 times, and so essentially that beam of light keeps pushing more effectively on a surface, and that would be a way to be less dependent on the sun, for example. But if you had, say, like a nuclear source, for example, for that laser, because if you don't have a sun, you'll need to have that power come from somewhere. But you're able to use another source than a sun, for example, like a collimated laser, to be able to push back and forth now. That's where my mind went. But granted, over long distances, it's tricky because, beam diffraction and all those things. But
it's quite fitting of the times now as people are trying to explore deep space transit and be like, how do you actually get from here to Mars or somewhere further than Mars? So hopefully maybe some people might find this especially interesting. But like, I definitely do think the science is being a bit limited right now. At least it's not easy to just go out and test a solar sail right now. It's not like you can't just go to your backyard and pull this off.
Unfortunately, yeah. And so, some people have demonstrated on a lab scale at least. And I'm sure there's probably some CubeSat missions getting ready now, if not have recently flown, that probably are demonstrating the concept. Maybe on shorter scales than Mars, but laser comms have made great progress, and it's a short step up, I guess, from laser comms.
No, for sure, definitely. Something else that's coming up to my mind, a completely different sector, but crystal umbrellas. I'm thinking of a luxury vacation sort of thing. Crystals, diamonds, alluding to luxury, high quality products. Umbrella, you take an umbrella out to the beach, vacation, beach resort, summer warms. So I was just thinking crystal umbrella could be something like that. We don't have to dive into this further because, again, this has been something that's been hashed out for centuries now, I think, or at least a century. But I don't know, maybe you can lean into the space idea. Crystal umbrella could be some sort of orbiting a space resort, maybe, or something like that, because people are looking into space hotels or like another commercial international space station. You have VAST that's doing that, but you have maybe you could have an orbiting structure that is just purpose primarily just for a luxury. People maybe want to enjoy a view of the Earth from space or something like that. I'm sure a lot of rich people would pay a nice penny for that, for sure.
Or even sorry to backtrack a little bit, but you actually remind me of something that I mentioned earlier, which is the idea of using crystals to like selectively block certain wavelengths. You could easily use that on Earth. I'm not sure if this product exists, but let's say you want to go down to the beach and you like want to bask in the sun, but you don't want to get sunburned. Maybe there could be a crystal umbrella that prevents the direct radiation from cooking your skin, but it still keeps you nice and warm.
Like if you hate applying sunscreen, it just moderates the UV for you.
That would work really well for me.
So you set up like a umbrella and you can still, bask in the sun. You're not having to apply, like the grease.
I don't like
you do have to watch out for albedo and for albedo.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, bouncing off what you're saying, if how you have those screens that look transparent, they're essentially crystals, and based on a current you pass through, you can change the opacity.
Oh yeah.
I wonder if you could have that on the beach, and it's like
partial shade.
You're laying there and you're like, I would like 52% less sun today. So I'm just gonna go on your phone, tweak it, and you're like, less exposure. That could be kind of a cool application. Maybe for a resort, I don't know if everyone would come to the beach with their own crystal umbrella. But I could imagine a resort having like how you kind of
shelter where you have like a reclining chair underneath, like
exactly. Just have one you rent out for the day, for example. That could be an interesting sort of. I guess it ties a bit of like the luxury travel and accommodation with the use of crystal for selective blocking. That actually could be a pretty good business case. I
could totally see people
see that one.
I could totally see people going to the beach trying to go for a specific shade of tan on their skin. So maybe they're like, okay, I'm gonna
be automated.
I'm gonna set my crystal umbrella to accept 48% of incoming sunlight. So then I'll have my shade to be this specific thing. Especially maybe if you're a model or someone trying to, or an action movie star trying to go for
specific. It could basically take a photo of you before it tans, and then it could selectively basically occlude parts of the umbrella, so that it tans you unevenly, so that you end up with an even tan.
Right.
For example, if you already have tan lines, it'll like essentially account for where the sun is, where it would fall on you, and then occlude like those parts. And as the sun moves, it continues to occlude those parts.
Yeah, I was thinking about like as the sun changes, it maybe can adapt. But I like the idea of a localized tan because you get to even out your tan, or if you're burning up too much, it's gonna be like, hey, we're noticing you're 2 shades of red higher, so we're gonna dial it back. But it could guarantee you don't overcook, I guess, and that's actually
guarantee you even tan.
Yeah. That's a good one. I think whoever's listening should probably run with that one. That's a good one. I could see the merit of that. I think, you look at tanning beds and other things like that. So there is a market for that. this would be outside, more natural, which I think people
It
might
would be more
appreciate.
enjoyable. Yeah.
On vacation, right? There's nothing worse than you're on vacation. You have a horrible tan, and then the next few days you're just like, ow, ow. You know?
Yeah.
Really ruins that jet ski ride the next day. So I was thinking a different direction too, of less, and not enthusiastic, but a less optimistic one perhaps, because, you know, we recently had the LA fires, and, you know, California just has a bunch of natural disasters kind of like, you know, lingering. Crystal umbrella really makes me think of like a defensive kind of structure you could have, whether it's for a flood or you know, maybe even fire, you know, whether that's at a personal shelter level or for a house even, or just not even a house, but like say a barrier that you could help defend against a wildfire, like some kind of like, you know, you have some walls, for example, you can use for like flooded areas that help redirect water. If you have like a crystal makes me think of something, you know, strong and maybe to some extent fire resistant, although, you know, at those temperatures, your selection of materials, you know, you go down to and a wall of, you know, heavy metal carbide is not going to be very easy to transport. But if there was some way to have like a nice little umbrella that can help deflect things like that, that could have been, you know, really practical.
In light of this idea and tying it back to something a bit more serious as well, just hearing the word crystal umbrella, I could kind of see that along the same lines with like the Iron Dome from Israel. So I do wonder, crystal umbrella, because like maybe you use it to protect an area, like maybe like it is something dealing with natural disasters, wildfires, especially in California for sure. But I do wonder, crystal umbrella, again, I wonder what you can use specifically with crystals to help protect a city or an area from external threats, whether that's just a storm, maybe it is a projectile, maybe it could be just drones, mentioning in light of in light of recent events. But yeah. So
yeah. I mean, sticking to the crystals, I guess, yeah. You can have some fairly strong material properties as well. You know, might be a bit more brittle. I guess it depends on what application you're doing. But yeah. Hail protection for your car as you're driving. Maybe in Texas somewhere where you're subject to the hail. Still the tanning bed though, or natural tanning bed.
The natural tanning umbrella.
Yeah, that like makes a good use of both keywords.
Trying to think of a completely different idea to go off of.
Mary Poppins. No.
It could be an ultralight umbrella that has enough lift to bring you into the sky.
Yeah.
That's how she takes off. Her umbrella is a solar sail. She's just taking off.
Someone's photonically recycling Mary Poppins.
Exactly.
You were going to go in a different direction, I think.
No. I was just saying I'm trying to think of something.
Oh, gotcha. All right. Well, I think this was our good and honest take at today's Thanks Mom. Remember to share in the comments if you would have taken this in a different direction, or if you would really enjoyed one of the implementations we talked about. Please take the self-adjusting solar tanning bed. That's a fun one to run with.
I think it's a good one for sure.
Yeah, let us know in the comments, or for the big question as well, if you have some other ways that you would have tackled this notion of how you use your intuition for call it data sparse environments. And we'll see you on the next show.
See you.
Thank you.